All right, it's BourbonBlog.com. I'm here with Colin. We're talking about Kings County, and you've just launched. We're 5 or 6. Is it maybe 6 years, 6 releases of Empire Rye, right, Colin?
I think this is our fifth release
Fifth release.
of
Fifth release.
Empire Rye, and the
Right.
first one to kind of include multiple years of inventory. I mean, to some extent,
Yes.
the first year, the rules are that it has to be 2 years old. So,
Yeah.
Empire Rye, like many things in American whiskey, is just kind of coming of age, finding its feet, and so it's a very exciting moment to kind of be talking about Empire Rye again in the greater context of rye whiskey and American whiskey. It's a cool project, which we can talk more about, but
Yes.
just very excited to finally get this year's 2022 release into the
2022
world.
release of Empire Rye, and it's not just, well, it is a clever name, but it's just not a clever name in case people are watching, they have not heard about Empire Rye, only heard a little bit about Empire Rye. Empire Rye
Right.
is an actual category, a recognized category of rye from New York. Tell us, what is Empire Rye?
So Empire Rye is a project that was begun by a group of New York distillers who got together and said, Kentucky has bourbon, Tennessee has Tennessee whiskey. What is the New York style of whiskey? What is the history of New York's whiskey? And so rye whiskey was the answer to that question.
Yes.
Certainly Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, all were very active rye producing states. Really before the Civil War, more whiskey was coming out of New York, Philadelphia, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland than certainly Kentucky or Tennessee. So to kind of go into that deeper history of distilling American whiskey culture and come up with a standard of identity, which just in our case is rye grain grown in New York State, that's then distilled in New York State by a New York distiller, and then meets the criteria for straight rye whiskey from the federal government. There's one added little piece about barrel entry strength. We do ask that distillers go in at a low entry proof and use a high component of rye in the mash bill. So 75% New York grown rye is a part of it. And that basically, that comprises the rules for Empire Rye whiskey.
I know it's a little bit of a tongue twister, especially after a little.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I
don't want to say it after you've had too many.
After this, because this is 51. This is good. This is 51%. This is at least 75% rye as a mash bill, and it has to be at least 75% from New York.
So it has to be 100. Well, the rye has to be 100% grown in New York State.
Okay, has to be 100%. Any rye you're using this 100% grown in New York State, and at least 75% as a mash bill. Then is that right?
And at least 75% as a mash bill. Yeah, and that goes back to in New York State, we have a craft distiller's provision that if you use 75% local grown grain, you can qualify for a farm distiller's license.
Right.
So many people in New York were already making rye whiskey with at least 75% New York grown rye grain, and therefore that made it a little bit of an easy thing to kind of build the rules around what was already existing in our legal landscape.
Right. Are most of the distillers most of the distillers we know of actually qualifying for that farm distillers?
Yeah, I mean, certain people, it was a project that was hatched by 6 or 7 of us, 3 of us in New York City, and then some Hudson Valley distillers, Rochester distiller. So Hudson is a part of this. People know that. Copper Sea, New York Distilling Company, Van Brunt, Black Button, Finger Lakes Distilling, all making an Empire Rye whiskey as the sort of founding members. But now there are others who have liked the concept. Maybe they were already making whiskey that way. And so they've kind of signed on to the idea of Empire Rye. And so, again, this is a thing that in a certain way the idea was hatched in 2015, but of course whiskey takes time to age. So it was really 2017 when we first released a little trickle of it. And then as time has gone on, now we're looking at barrels going back all the way to 2017. So that's where our barrel strength, we have a 6-year rye that came out this year. So that one was distilled all the way back in 2017.
You're going.
I'm sorry, 2016, I guess.
16. You're going back some older stock, and of course, all of your whiskeys, as your distillery has gotten older, have all gotten older. We love everything that you're producing. You released, forgetting, was it about year and a half ago or so? You had your oldest release ever at 7, 8 years old. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, we've done a couple 7, 8 year single barrels. We do have a lot of inventory in that range. At this point, we have some 9, we have some 9-year barrels that we're probably going to save for, even older than that. But the oldest sort of practical barrels that we have in inventory are 9 years old. We do have a 12-year-old barrel, but that's just the sort of first barrel that we laid down. Actually, it was actually the 100th barrel that we laid down, because those first we were so eager to get at them. It took us 100 barrels to realize, oh, actually, we should maybe set some of these aside.
Maybe now we should but it's the first one. It's the first one that's still remaining.
Yes,
from those. This is delicious. So I have two here. I have one at 51%, 102 proof. The other one is pretty close to 120 proof. This is the first time you've released a barrel strength rye, Empire Rye. How old are each of these? The barrel's a little older.
So the regular release was from the season that was 3 years ago. So it doesn't have a 3-year age statement, because the rye distilling season runs basically through December. So if we want to get the rye in front of people before Christmas, it makes sense to kind of cut into that. So it's like 2.9 years up to 4.9 years for the regular rye whiskey, and then it's a full 6 years for that particular barrel strength rye whiskey. And it's, Kings County tends to have a pretty high barrel strength, but because this was an entry proof of 110, usually we go in at 116. It didn't climb that much, so this is around 120 proof, a little bit lower than typical for a Kings County barrel strength whiskey, but it's still totally lovely. I have to say.
It's so good. This is so nice. I mean, you get, and this reminds me somewhat of last year's, but it's a little different, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, this is, our rye tends to have, first of all, we don't have any corn in the rye. So that's one big differentiating factor. It's pot distilled. It's aged in smaller format barrels. So each of those, all of that is pointing to flavor. Right. I mean, you've got a very heavy rye sort of concentration. You're pot distilling, so you're protecting those flavors through your distillation and having a very viscous, richly tasting distillate. And then you're kind of, in our case, aging those in smaller format barrels just to get a lot of barrel influence in a short amount of time. Which, if you're talking about a small barrel after almost 5 or 6 years, that's going to have a huge, that's a flavor bomb. And most rye whiskeys aren't. I mean, I think it's important to remember that rye whiskey died out in the United States. It got bought by the bourbon distillers when nobody wanted any rye at all, and all the Pennsylvania rye and all the New York rye and all the Maryland rye basically got, a day of production at a bourbon distillery in Kentucky. And that was it. That was the landscape of rye whiskey until really, I think, when Dad's Hat, which is not far from Philadelphia, brought rye whiskey making back to Pennsylvania, and some distillers in New York were making rye whiskey. So rye really belongs now, in my opinion, to the smaller distillers who are really trying to redo it in the old way, and not necessarily using a bourbon distillery with a high core content in a column still. That's really an afterthought of a bourbon producer.
So in some ways, I mean, do you feel like this is what it might have tasted like many years ago?
I have no doubt this is more like what rye whiskey would have tasted a little bit pre-Prohibition or just after Prohibition, when you're talking about those distillers that did remain after Prohibition, when they really got started in earnest. Overholt, Shenley, Michter's, the old Michter's, those were the sort of rye brands that lasted through, but they closed in the 70s, and the brands got sold off and became parts of other things, and those distilleries closed. And really, you know, it's not like Kentucky where you have these beautiful old facilities that have been there for hundreds of years. That heritage, as it pertains to rye, is really gone. Those distilleries have been torn down, or they're in complete ruins. So there's not much chance to do what you see at a distillery like Castle and Key, where you can go back to this great old temple of bourbon making and renovate it for a new era. Rye whiskey doesn't have that history and heritage. So we will take it. You know, we're like young distillers. We don't have these beautiful old facilities, but we do have a little bit of a connection to that sort of older process and attention to detail. And we have the same grain. The grain hasn't changed. The climate hasn't. Maybe it has changed a little bit, but not enough to make a huge difference. So I do believe that distillers in New York and Pennsylvania are really kind of bringing rye back in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think to look at the landscape of rye whiskey.
And it's very similar to the way it used to be. I mean, that's part of when you started creating rye. You were like, I want it to taste like it might have.
Yeah. To use and all of those pieces are it's a production oriented. The rules around Empire Rye are really for distillers. They're not for marketing. They're not for the sort of there's other sort of classes and categories of whiskey, but this one is really focused on the distillation and what that will mean for the spirit.
What it will come through. This is 100% rye.
So this is 75% rye.
75% rye.
No, I'm sorry. This is at least 75%, but in our case, it's actually 80% rye.
80.
And then 20% Golden Promise, which is a malted barley that we source from England.
Right.
So it's the same barley that we use for our straight bourbon, and the same mash bill that we use for our straight bourbon, but just substituting rye for the corn that we normally use.
What is that bar? I mean, again, I've always loved, and of course, we love the peated bourbon. We love the bourbons. But what does that particular barley from England do that you found that it does so well?
Well, in Kentucky, you talk about a flavor grain where you have your malted barley and you have your corn, and then you have some other grain that's there for flavor, and usually that's rye or wheat.
Right.
But malted barley worldwide is the most common flavor grain. If you look at what makes single malt whiskey, the flavor grain is malted barley. So in our case, we were looking at kind of these kind of older heritage grains that were typical in Scotch production, and that some of the brewers were getting their hands on in the U.S. So there was a kind of opportunity to try this heritage grain for the Scotch industry and use it for bourbon, and it was great. I mean, we tried other strains and more conventional Canadian, 2-row barley, just not nearly as interesting or as flavorful as the Golden Promise that we use. So we've used that in all of our whiskeys that call for malted barley, and that's pretty much all of them.
Beautiful, and it does come across so lovely. And again, this Golden Promise is a barley you do see and taste in a lot of Scotch whiskeys.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, a lot of our whiskeys tend to tread a line between the American tradition and that sort of older, old world tradition, which you see in Scotch and Irish whiskey. And sometimes we get a little bit like, well, why aren't you making it like bourbon? But I think, bourbon maybe got a little lazy at some point. It was like, oh, we can use a column still. We can use, we can kind of go in this more efficient, more practical, more modern tradition. And that old pot distilled bourbon, that old pot distilled rye, those things have kind of gone by the wayside, and it's left a lot of smaller distillers to pick it up again and say, no, you've actually never had bourbon whiskey. You've never had rye whiskey until you try some of this stuff. And, for years, craft distillers didn't have properly aged whiskey, but now we do. And I think the difference shows when you're looking at this is an average 4.5 year rye whiskey. You compare it to a 4.5 year rye whiskey out of a column still in a bourbon distillery. I hope that it's no contest.
This is so unique and different. and the flavor and the depth and the mouthfeel. There's a wonderful rich mouthfeel on this, but yet it is soft. It's warm, but yet it has this wonderful texture that's easy. It goes between, I do get some of that beautiful clove, like you would get on some rice. I get some of like some black tea. Almost this element of, there's a little bit of this brown sugar against black tea. I mean, what all has happened to get these flavors that we usually never get on other ryes?
Yeah, I would just say it's a very high concentration of rye. That is a part of it. It's the pot stills preserve that flavor as opposed to a column still. I mean, you have at MGP, you have a 95% rye sort of recipe thing, but then a lot of that flavor is stripped out by using a column still. And so in our case, we're using a lot of rye grain, then we're preserving that through distillation, and then we're complementing it through a very particular barrel program and a very particular blending program. I mean, I say blending, that's just taking, here we have 3 different years or 4 different years worth of barrels of rye. So you have to bring those barrels together, those different seasons, to make a blend that really highlights the best of what you can do. And so Ryan and Nathan, who are in charge of that process, I give them full credit for assembling the whiskey in such a way that makes the most of all the other pieces, the grain, the distillation, the maturation.
Also beautiful. And again, we're tasting with Colin here, Kings County. Tell us down below if you're trying from Kings County. I'm sure we have I see a lot of you already are Kings County fans. If you're not, you got to try some of their rye, some of their bourbon. There's all types of spirits they do, and you're in more and more states than you've ever been. How many states are you in total?
Yeah, we're in about 20 states now, probably heading into Colorado and Illinois next year. So more easier than ever. Also, e-commerce has made it easier to get our stuff. So you could just go to our website if you live in most states and order it. It goes through a New York retailer. But the Empire Rye is one that comes out once a year and goes pretty fast. So that will have at the distillery.
Why only once a year? Is it?
Well, because the rye is harvested once a year. It's the old agricultural thing that you grow the grain and then we
only once a year
distill it. So yes, I mean corn grows once a year too, but no. But in our case, we harvest the rye. I want to say late August, early let's say September, and then it gets to us beginning of October. We distill it through about the end of November, and then that's when we start to assemble the whiskeys into a blend. And so that is year over year the way that we've done the rye distillation season. So we really do follow the farms. I mean, it's a funny thing to think about when you're a business and a distillery and working on a timeline of many years, but that is how we do it.
You're following the farms, and again, it usually comes out right around now. The Empire Rye. Late fall, early winter. First time ever again with this barrel proof one is beautiful. Again, this is a little over 6, and the original is a blend of 3 to 5. Is that what you said?
Yeah, basically. I mean, it's exactly 3 seasons ago.
Both and really older than that.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. Yeah. The 6 years from a 53-gallon barrel.
Wow.
The regular is a mix of, I think there's even some 10s in there, 10s, 15s, and 53. So a lot of our whiskeys do play with barrel size, which is more, again, a little just more like a Scotch process where you have quarter casks and sherry butts and American Standard barrels, just kind of a suite of different barrels and things that you then assemble in a blending room. We're kind of doing the same thing, but for American whiskey.
You use those smaller barrels. Again, you were in the early days of the craft distilling of the new generation, one of the first to experiment with those. You had smaller barrels. That's all you were using for a while, right? Was the smaller barrel?
Yeah, to some extent. We started laying down the full-size barrels probably in 2014 is when that got started, or actually 2013. Yeah. And but then exclusively on full-size barrels pretty much since 2019. So just next year is when most of our 4-year inventory is going to be exclusively out of 53-gallon barrels. But we still have quite a bit of those smaller barrels that are in the 6, 7, 8, 9-year range that are still very useful as single barrels. I mean, if you see a single barrel of Kings County, I've seen some amazing store pick single barrels go out this year. Black Bourbon Society had a great one. If you find one of those store pick single barrels from Kings County, they're really cool. But that's just really kind of coming back to that's a lot of the smaller format inventory that's really reached into very old for the size of the cooperage, and it does really cool things to whiskey that I think other people were, impatient and never quite got around to seeing.
Wow. So again, at some point you're going to be going completely to the larger barrel.
Well, it's a good question, because then we started to miss the small format flavor. Okay. And so now we've actually gone back and started filling 30-gallon barrels, not going all the way back down to 10s and 15s, which are pretty impractical. But a 30-gallon barrel is a nice sort of, it's not quite a quarter cask. It's, it's not so small as to be impractical, but it's not quite the 50-gallon standard American barrel. So it's a little bit of a compromise there.
And we were just talking about, Colin, you and I were before the interview. You were saying New York State, and again, if you have it in smaller barrels, it's going to age quicker because of the way it's designed.
Let's not say it's going to. I mean, it's going to do certain aspects of maturation will accelerate.
Accelerating.
Let's phrase it that way. Less people
going to accelerate the maturation smaller, but it's going to not be completely the same as it would be in a larger barrel.
Right.
And then you have the New York weather compared to Kentucky. Right. Talk about that a little bit.
Right. So we've noticed that in New York we have I mean, I grew up in Kentucky, so I know a little bit what the climate is. And in New York, you see a little bit colder winters than Kentucky, but the summers are just as hot. So, I just sort of, and this is a hypothesis. This is my sort of scientific opinion as a theater studies major, But I do think there are certain things that are happening in our barrels that we don't necessarily see out of every other craft distillery or out of Kentucky distillers or out of Scottish distillers, where our proof really climbs up in certain instances to these kind of hazmat proofs over 140 and above, out of a barrel that went in at 116. So you have this really different processes happening in the barrel. The small barrel may manipulate that somewhat. Even with our large format barrels, we see the same thing going on, but to a more muted degree. So it's just to say that the age and climate makes a difference, and that's true in Scotland. It's true in Kentucky. It's true in Texas, where those whiskeys are very different, and you see they're doing a lot in a short amount of time with very dry desert temperatures. So it's opening up a whole new world of whiskey that. Some of it, in our case, it was a world of whiskey that existed long, long ago, but none of that whiskey really remains. In Texas, it's kind of new territory. Pacific Northwest, you have these great sort of single malt whiskeys, but again, very different from what's coming out of Scotland. So it's just a very exciting time to be both a distiller, but then also a consumer of a drinker.
It really is. And again, if you're a fan of rye and you want to taste rye in a completely different way that in some ways goes back in time, but also represents something, a new category, fairly new category. Log on kingscountydistillery.com. You can ship to a lot of states. You can find it in a lot of liquors. Wait, can you find it in some liquor stores? The Empire Rye, you can, right?
You can, yeah. I mean, it's any state that carries Kings County will get an allocation of the rye whiskey. And so, searching online, if you don't see it from our website, you can search around online. Most people do, can some way or another, it's there.
Slightly smaller than your bourbon allocation. I mean, it's a fair amount smaller than your bourbon allocation.
Oh, yeah, a lot smaller than bourbon.
A lot smaller. Okay. And then there's this always been a big fan of not only Colin and his whiskey, but the labels, the design. And then we have this new blue label. This is not in any way well. Hey, we like Kentucky Blue, but this is not Kentucky, right?
Right.
Colin and I are both from Kentucky. This is not Kentucky Blue. Or why did you pick blue for this one? Maybe it is. I don't know.
It's a good question. Well, we wanted something that would signal that this is different than the sort of straight whiskeys that we usually make.
Yes.
And so it's a whole different category of whiskey, which is blended bourbon. So people know blended Scotch whiskey, like Johnny Walker, Chivas, and Dewar's. This is blended bourbon, which is you got to go into the TTB regs and the government sort of definitions to find it, but it's essentially 51% bourbon. The rest could be neutral grain spirit. In our case, we use all straight whiskeys, all 2-year whiskeys.
Okay.
But there's some rye whiskey, there's some malt whiskey, there's some corn whiskey in there. But the majority of it is straight bourbon.
At least 2 years old. Over 51% is going to be straight bourbon. All that's about 2 to 3 years old in here.
2 to 3 years old. Yeah. The idea behind this was most of our whiskeys at this point are 4, 5, 6 years. We have, again, those specialty 7 and 8 years. Let's go back to some of those. Let's go back to doing a 2-year-old whiskey. What's the best way we can make a 2-year whiskey that's accessible, that's a little lower priced, that's suitable for mixing? Yeah. So, I mean, after the rye, it's going to be a little bit of a the rye is so chewy and full flavor.
Yeah, it's a lot of caramel, a lot of nice vanilla, right? It's
yes, exactly.
It's solid. It's unique. It's easy. It's really easy to drink.
Yeah. So I mean, I find myself gravitating to it quite a bit, just as a sort of, it's not. There's a lot of options when you want that very high proofed, really oak forward barrel strength, kind of thing. But when you want something that's a little bit on the lighter profile, that's an interesting question, is what do you look for? And a lot of the lighter profiled American whiskeys tend to be on the cheap side, and therefore they're a little, solventy, or, they get that sort of nail polish remover kind of nose on them. This is aiming to be a very well-made young whiskey, and what can you do in that space? So that's what our blended whiskey is. Different color to sort of set it apart from our other whiskeys, and that is, depends on where you are in the world, but that's around $55. Is the sort of average price that you'll find, which is, our regular whiskeys are in the sort of $75 range. So this is more accessible.
This is interesting, and it has a lot of the nice bourbon-like notes, the caramels, the vanillas. I get something maybe towards the end that's slightly citrus, bright, maybe slightly tropical in a good way. It has that kind of nice, leans towards, I wouldn't say rum, but it kind of has this nice, very relaxed, sort of almost kind of like tiki note. Do you get that?
Yeah, I don't know what to say that is. That might be some of that rye that's bringing in some clove, some black tea. That's just adding a little bit of a base note, or you have corn whiskey, which is a very light, sort of kind of vanilla cream if you do it well, which is a little hard to pull off. Yeah. So hard to know where particular notes are coming from. But one thing that's nice on this is you do get the full breakdown. What's in the bottle. So if on your hang tag, I don't know if you've got the hang tag in your sort of 200 ml, but the 750 size comes with the full breakdown of what's inside it. And I think blended has a bad reputation in the US. We're a straight whiskey culture, but transparency is the thing that people really want out of both their straight whiskeys and their blended whiskeys.
Sure.
So if you can say truthfully what's going in that bottle, I think people will consider it in a different way than they would if you don't tell people what's in the bottle. Even if you don't tell people what it is, and it's a 4-year straight bourbon whiskey, this in a way is telling you a lot more information than merely that, sort of straight bourbon designation will tell you.
So as we look at this, it may or may not be somewhat an homage to Kentucky Blue, but maybe Colin wanted to hear someone come in and say, "May I have some of the blue label, please?"
Right. I mean, it is definitely designed. Well, we also came out with a black label this year, which is kind of for our
Black
we
label
started
blue.
putting our 7 and 8 year stuff into black label as a way to set that apart, because now we're we've been around for a long time. We've been around for 13 years, so we have to kind of help people differentiate.
Oh, I understand.
Like all of these whiskeys in that
The
time.
simplicity of the bottle too. I mean, I love
Right.
the simple. What was in the
So
black
how do we
label?
keep it? The black label, we did it was a blender's reserve. We did a black label bottled and bond.
Nice.
So we're just starting to kind of understand how that whole thing works. But basically 1% of what we put out in a given year will be that sort of black label tier. And then the hope is that people will embrace this blue label and make that sort of our the everyday thing that hopefully, when you first get into bourbon or whiskey in the US, that's where you'll start, and then you'll work your way up to the sort of higher age statement, barrel strength stuff. That's
sure. I think it's a great introduction offering, and just really is something interesting for Kings County fans, and just for any fans of some really interesting blended bourbon. It's really well done.
Yeah, I mean, as a person who has spent a lot of time in the more sort of flavor forward spectrum of American whiskey, because of my own preference, and also that's where the market is right now, it is kind of cool to go into the sort of like, let's look at the challenge is, how do you make a good 2-year whiskey? And that every distiller faces that, or maybe every distiller isn't trying to do that, but it's an interesting game to play, and I encourage every other distiller in the country to join me in the challenge.
2-year challenge. I think you've laid
down
the
2-year challenge, right?
Yeah, because you don't see many doing that.
Right. Make a whiskey.
And if they are
2-year
doing
age statement,
not as well as this. I mean, some of them are. Don't get me wrong, but it's tough.
Sure.
2-year-old. Yeah. I've had a lot of some. There's been some really good 2s I've had, but this would be tough to do.
Yeah,
and blended so masterfully. I mean, this is really, really nice.
Yeah, and just helps tell that story about there's the distiller who makes whiskey, and then there's the blender who makes whiskey.
Right.
And in the U.S., we invest a lot in the former. In Scotland, they invest a lot in the latter. But here's a whiskey that actually pulls from both sides. The distiller is important, and the blender is important.
Great finish too. I'm just the more I'm tasting this nice dry finish. Again, some of that fruit, some of that grain coming through. Again, we always love having Colin on our show here. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel, like this video, share it. We always have so much fun talking and tasting through the new whiskeys he's doing. Anything, we got the Empire, we have the blended, the cast strength Empire. Anything else coming 2023 we should be watching for from you?
Well, who knows what's coming down the pipe at Kings County. Also, I've written some books on whiskey, and maybe another one of those in the works.
It could be a book coming, because that will be how many books you've done. You've done so many.
Guide to Urban Moonshining came out in 2013. Dead Distillers came out in 2015. Unfortunately, not enough people bought Dead Distillers. That was a really cool book. But,
yes, it was.
And
it is.
It's still around. You can still get it.
No, it's dead. It's still alive. Keep on. You can go on your website and find it, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But there will be another book coming, so that's another thing that'll come out next year. In addition to the usual,
what's your focus?
It's a travelogue around American whiskey, distillers, whiskeys from around the country. A lot of time in Kentucky, obviously, because there's a lot of concentration of distillers in Kentucky, but visiting a little bit of a wider world of whiskey than that has come up with us in the craft scene. I mean, many distillers have opened in the last 20 years, and they have begun to articulate a different landscape of whiskey that I think people are just kind of getting their bearings on. And so it's been fun for me as a distiller to go see what other people care about. What are they doing differently? What does that say about where they're located and what their ambitions are and who they want to be like? And what does that mean for whiskey? What does that mean for the person who drinks whiskey and buys whiskey. All very cool stuff that I think really just, again, reinforces that we are in a golden time for American whiskey.
Yes, we are. And again, we say it often, we say it when we're talking about what we like, but we really, here at BourbonBog, we love your whiskeys. As far as some of our very favorites made outside of Kentucky, this is definitely one of the tops. I mean, it's such good, interesting bourbons, ryes, everything you do. It's so different from other flavors, and it's done so well. So keep up the great work to you and your team, Colin.
Yes, thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Really well done. And keep on watching. We'll have some other great, even before the Christmas holiday and other holidays that are coming. We're going to have some other great tastings we're doing. We should say also, if you have a bourbon or rye lover or whiskey lover in your life, Kings County makes a great holiday gift.
Sure. We have gift sets that are very nice.
You can gift sets online.
Sample through the different whiskeys. Yeah.
Sample through them. So, it's something, if maybe they haven't heard of Kings County, you want to think of something they haven't heard of. This may be one that they haven't heard of that would be great to get. What's going to be your holiday pour? When you pour for the holidays, what's the most holiday?
I will probably be pouring this blended whiskey, which it's what I'm going to get everybody. Don't tell them, but I'm going to get everybody in my family.
Everybody gets one. Don't tell.
Right.
Secret.
So
you make with it, or you just like doing it on the rocks?
I've been making Manhattans with it, which is pretty fun. And yeah, it's a fun whiskey to play with, and I haven't necessarily looked to play with many of the Kings County whiskeys because they're so good on their own. Yeah. But this one, I feel like I have a little license to kind of go a little crazy with. So, yeah.
Well done. These are all delicious. Empire Rye once a year. Keep on looking for all their other whiskeys, the peated bourbon, the bourbon, everything we love that they do, the chocolate throughout the year. And this will be always throughout the year release, right?
Yeah, totally. Always in stock.
Colin, thanks for joining us on BourbonBog. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Always a pleasure to be on the show.
Thanks, man. Thanks for watching us, and